Good day, conference delegates, organizers, colleagues. My name is Dr. Sandra Gertenbach. I'm presenting on behalf of a team who have worked together on this report, still work in progress, on supply chain resilience in Africa. And the aim of it is to develop viable interventions that harness the opportunities of a specific country and regional value chains on the continent of Africa. So we tried to classify supply chain typologies in regions of Africa: macroeconomic, trade, production, infrastructure and logistics. Look at their exposure and vulnerability to risks and shocks, and apply the key difference and novel approach in the study was to apply data-driven freight flow modeling to identify explicit country and inter-country value chains for increased resilience and advancement, and then evaluate that macro logistics resilience and create innovative interventions for a particular country or region that could be implemented by government and business to mitigate risk and improve resilience. We've superimposed countries, big global economies, onto the map of Africa. And what you can see is the disproportionate density and trade openness of Africa relative to its size against other big global economies. We need to manage the risks, improve resilience, and harness the potential of Africa. And there's some unique characteristics of supply chains in Africa. They mostly have been developed to accommodate mining and agricultural networks exploiting raw materials extraction, but they're less developed supply chains for beneficiated, processed and consumer goods, and also agricultural goods. The vital foodstuffs and product imports are typically sourced from the East, and this necessitated the evolution of import supply chains. But inter-regional sourcing isn't optimized. There's long, relatively simple supply chains for export, as I said, for raw materials, and less developed supply chains for food and for trade across countries in Africa. We need those regional chains and secure food distribution, because their lack hinders the informal economy and access to markets. We need to stimulate industrialization. Also in Africa, there's increased awareness and pressure to adopt sustainable practices and allocate accountability, for example, for traceability of products exported. And supply chain development needs to happen to address humanitarian crises and food security in vulnerable African countries. So we need to address the transport system, decongest it, and improve the living conditions, grow connectivity, develop blockchain technologies, and develop strategies that would reduce the vulnerability to cyber attacks. So we need to generate and direct specific Africa supply chain resilience interventions, not a one-size-fits-all. The other aspect of the need for resilient supply chains is the very low levels of intra-regional trade in Africa. So intra-regional trade at the moment is 10.5% in tonnages, 6.2% of value of the total trade. And we have an African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that has been signed by most countries in Africa, gaining momentum, so it requires readiness and macro-logistics resilience for intra- and inter-regional trade growth. Build up the resilience for undeveloped or underdeveloped regional value chains to make them more efficient and resilient. If you look at the kinds of risks that the world is exposed to, economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, technological, and South Africa is faced with the same risks, but exacerbated by inadequate capacity, vulnerability to natural forces, low network density, cyber attacks, and lack of modal diversity. So there's little opportunity for alternatives when exposed to a risk. So we're looking at building resilience to mitigate exposure to those risks and better ways to recover from the shocks, improve country self-sufficiency, and harness opportunities. And we've done that by looking at freight flows from source to transformation to where they're consumed, and the logistics and transport networks that serve those freight flows. When we talk about building resilient supply chains, a couple of aspects of it, and being able to anticipate and detect so that we're ready to minimize and mitigate those risks. And when a disruption occurs with an impact and consequences, the country is better able to recover, to bounce back, and reposition to return to normal or a state better than before the disruption. So it's about speed, ease, agility, capacity, and the extent of that recovery in the shortest possible time. And there's a couple of matrices that we've developed just in terms of the need to build research and allocate budgets to monitor, to detect the risks, and invest so that the country is ready with action plans when an incident occurs. So there's a high cost of vulnerability and very weak resilience, especially when no investment is made in preparing for these unknown factors and determining the probability of those things occurring. If you look at the economic challenges in Africa, we've looked not only at economic indices, but also things like the State Resilience Index. The blue graphs, you'll see the top 5 countries, Scandinavian, European countries, the BRICS countries performing better, Brazil, China, Russia, India, and South Africa. And then some of the other key countries in Africa, Botswana, Ethiopia, Egypt, Nigeria, Mali, Libya, South Sudan, all have much lower state resilience index. And if you look at the FM Global Resilience Index, looking at the supply chains, it tells the same story, performing way below the European, Scandinavian, and BRICS counterparts. We need to build capability and strengthen resilience. We also look at GDP growth, and Africa's growth projections have consistently been unmet, but also lagging behind the rest of the developing world. So behind Asia and other emerging market and developing economies. If you look at the GDP per capita growth, the blue line in the graph on the left is the world excluding Africa, and it's an indication of the poverty in many of the regions of Africa. Also on the right, indicating the severe prevalence of food insecurity. high percentage of the population exposed to hunger. So we need to develop these resilient freight flows and distribution to address the population food security. You look at the bars on the right, you'll see the extent of hungry populations, particularly in southern Africa. Then we've mapped all of these countries just to get an idea of the extent of their vulnerability. We've developed a matrix reflecting trade openness and economic density. So the big 3 countries in Africa that have the greatest GDP, South Africa, Nigeria, and the Arab Republic of Egypt, are all in that quadrant of high economic density and low trade openness, which indicates the extent of their self-sufficiency, whereas most of the countries in Africa, low economic density, long distances to travel, and a reliance on other countries for trade, that low trade openness. What we've done to address this issue is look at value and supply chain flows determined by flow analysis. We look at the economic components, the risks and shocks, try to identify weaknesses in supply chains, where are the gaps, opportunities, and ultimately to propose interventions that would increase resilience. And we've done that country by country with case studies, and in some cases just snapshot views of a supply chain, looking at commodities from source. Are they imported, local, regional? Where are they transformed? And where are they used and consumed? And what are the transport and logistics flows that enable the movement from source to beneficiation to consumption? So we look at land and resources with such risks as natural disasters, price resources, so a reliance on a commodity that is impacted by commodity price fluctuations. Look at industry beneficiation levels, an energy crisis, debt crisis, people and development, the extreme poverty, disease, hunger, censorship, and institutions. How do they fare in terms of corruption, geopolitical issues, and often political interventions and coups? And with all of these, they can be addressed. So land and resources can be addressed by spatial planning, logistics infrastructure, the capacity, the modal integration, logistics skills development on the people side, and policy, pricing, taxes, planning instruments, balancing modes. And each of those, we've been able to identify some of the risks, and always acknowledging that there are trade-offs to be made. Efficiency and resilience, efficiency and sustainability, resilience and sustainability, and the costs of those. Digitalizing to improve supply chain and mitigating the risk of cyber attacks. So some of the strategies for Africa's supply chain resilience are similar to those adopted in the developed world, but we need to build inventory and capacity buffers, form strategic ecosystem partnerships, develop markets and trading platforms that would enable the informal sector, improve visibility, information sharing, and knowledge management. Looking at sourcing alternatives, where can commodities be imported from in the region transported across countries within the region, transporting fertilizers within the region to enable that agricultural sector and to address hunger, and then transforming industries, manufacturing processes, and of course building transport and logistics capacity. So investing in infrastructure and assets to develop alternative modes, operations, and nodes to build that diversity, flexibility, adaptiveness, and responsiveness. So a couple of the policy instruments that go across that value chain from source to beneficiation to consumption. So we can look at incentives, taxes or subsidies, regulation that addresses price regulation, legislation and actual enforcement of regulations, technological integration and guidance to build information data systems, better land use measures, zoning and land supply, infrastructure in terms of heavy spend projects and other shorter term projects that could build resilience, and knowledge management. There's ways to build data and get more intelligence from freight and passenger transporters and also from other research initiatives. And obviously addressing these aspects, the cost of improving resilience versus the benefits to be gained in terms of food security, population well-being, improved environmental benefits, knowing that Africa is often suffers from some of the effects of climate change, not of its own making, and then of course economic benefits. We need to invest in resilience to reduce the cost of future potential shocks and threats, and especially in countries with high debt and limited means to finance resilience. And then if we adopt a macro logistics view with the freight flow modeling to assist in identifying the gaps and the nature of the support required, and so that we may escalate and prioritize and fund those interventions through appropriate and innovative funding mechanisms. So in conclusion, there are significant valuable theories and knowledge of the need to build resilience in supply chain in Africa. We need practical levers to prioritize and implement them, which is often lacking. We need requirements for risk mitigation, recovery and growth. We have a growing population. We need sustainable economic growth, food security, and we need to harness the potential that does exist in Africa and reduce its dependence on the global world. We know that the supply chains in Africa are less developed, they're vulnerable, they're raw material export orientated, and limited informal sector access to markets. But you can't have generic solutions. The supply chains are of different types. There's unique commodity supply and demand aspects, specific freight flows, value chains that lack connectivity, and different levels of vulnerability. So we need to improve the supply chain configuration to improve resilience through the focus on sources, commodity transformation, use and consumption, and of course the transport and logistics to optimize the flow of freight and leverage those strategies and policies for